We're 2 years into the war, and little by little, the West is at risk of abandoning Ukraine. We need a reality check about why we're in this place and what we can do to get out of it. Here is what will happen if Ukraine is forced into a peace. A Russo-Chinese quasi-alliance would have got away with redrawing European borders and conquering territory. If that happens, then you, if you're European, or your allies, if you're in the USA, would live under security arrangements that are a product of the power exercise of a Russo-Chinese alliance on European soil. Here is what else would happen. The peace may well not last. Putin will not stop unless he is stopped or unless he runs out of capacity. For the Kremlin, peace negotiations are a means of winning the war. More on that in a moment. If Russia resumes the war after the peace, NATO's survival could be at risk. Russia could resume the war in Ukraine or against NATO, for instance via an incursion in the Baltics. If Russia attacked NATO, for us that would be a new war, but not so for the Kremlin. Putin thinks he is already engaged in a defensive, necessary, existential, provoked escalation against the West, of which Ukraine is just one chapter. Let's be clear, the Kremlin doesn't want a big war with the West, just a confrontation. The terminus of the confrontation for the Kremlin is a challenge to Article 5, from which NATO runs away, thereby making it obsolete. In Russia, nobody can stop the Kremlin. Putin's brutal killing of Navalny has dashed hope in an already deeply depoliticized society. But contrary to Putin's grandiose mystical visions, he ain't alone in the world. There are others, we are among them, and we can stop him. But so far, we haven't. We've made life difficult for him, but we haven't gone for the jugular. We haven't made things existential for Putin. I want to go on a two-part rant that takes us to the core of the problem that we're in. First, we're in this mess because we still struggle to understand the Putin regime. But second, and more importantly, because of the weakness of our democracies at home, we struggle to come up with strategy abroad. There are three things that we struggle to understand about the Kremlin. The Kremlin's foreign escalations are driven by regime security. The Kremlin has a dogmatic belief about the weakness and decline of the West. And the Kremlin is apocalyptic in some of its thinking. Let's do regime security first. It's my view that regime security and war are now constitutively linked for the Putin regime. That doesn't just mean that more war is in the heads of Putin, Patrushev and the Kovalchuk brothers. It means that they are somewhat locked into this path by a reset they are experiencing onto a war footing that percolates the regime's propaganda, the regime's transformation of the education system, the regime's marination in the ideological wash they like to enjoy bathing themselves in, and the regime's transformation of the economy. The second thing we've got to understand about the Kremlin is their dogma about our weakness. They don't just have an empirical belief about the decline of Western democracies mediated by a crisis of trust. They believe that democracy is ephemeral. They believe that might is right, and that anybody who distinguishes power from authority is delusional. And they think that we, with our democratic institutions and our siren songs about democratic values, are going down. We're going to recede into history. And when you combine this with the Kremlin's view that the sovereignties of East European countries are toy sovereignties and that they have proprietorial claims over them, you get to the core of the issue, which is that our weakness and our democratic decline is the Kremlin's theory of victory. Let's do the third thing we've got to grasp, which is that the Kremlin is way more apocalyptic than most analysts allow. And we struggle to see this because of a couple of dispositions we have. We like to connect the Russian threat with the Soviet threat, and we like to think of international conflict as based on economics-type rationality. But Putin's regime is in some ways more like Al-Qaeda than Brezhnev's USSR, and their values aren't just power, security, wealth acquisition. They're also historical self-realization. We're dealing with ideas about how the cultural destiny of a nation can be expressed in the will of a single individual. That's Wagnerian stuff, and you're not going to read this in international relations textbooks. So we're dealing with an increasingly fanatical, somewhat apocalyptic, escalatory project which connects regime security with war and is dogmatic about our democratic collapse. These aren't just fancy thoughts for a philosophical seminar. They capture the outlook of the Kremlin, which informs the kind of threat that Biden and Macron and Scholz and Sunak and Starmer face. But grasping them isn't the only issue, because we've been having a problem putting up a convincing response. Let's talk about that. What's up with us is that we've got two obvious problems. We're struggling to support Ukraine enough, and we're struggling to come up with a strategy for the ex-Soviet space. But what's less obvious is why we're so stuck in these problems. But let's look at the problems first. Little by little, we're drifting toward abandoning Ukraine, though we won't abandon her entirely. We need to acknowledge that. Wishful thinking is a big part of politics, and seeing what you want to see rather than what's there is a very natural human instinct. But it's not helpful to stand around saying there are no weeds, when there are weeds around you. We witnessed a small number of Republicans in the House of Representatives obstructing aid for Ukraine, and getting military aid to Ukraine will not get easier. By 2025, we could have the orange thing in the White House, and the orange thing may wish to force Ukraine into an unsustainable peace without security guarantees. We've got to get real here. We're 2 years into the war, and are we backing Ukraine to regain its territories? No. Are we backing Ukraine to sacrifice its territories in exchange for EU accession and Western security guarantees? Maybe. Slightly siding toward a no than a yes. So that's our first problem. Our second problem is a lack of strategy. We have half a strategy toward Ukraine and virtually no strategy toward Russia. Our Ukraine strategy is to support Ukraine a little into the future and then see what happens. Our strategy for the politicization of the Russian space essentially doesn't exist, even though transformation on the Belarusian and on the Russian space is central to resolving the security crisis that we're all facing in Europe today. So our problems are unreliable support for Ukraine and a lack of strategy. And the million-dollar question is, can we get out of these problems? I want to recommend 3 remedies that are very far from everything, but they're a lot better than nothing. First, we've got to acknowledge where we're at and acknowledge how prone we are to denying where we're at. Let's be clear, it is pious and delusional to go on about keeping the rules-based liberal international order alive. It is broken. Part of the reason Putin invaded Ukraine in 2014 and followed that up with a full-scale invasion in 2022 is that the international order was broken. Putin's extreme conduct isn't a bug, it is a feature of the state of the international system, just a very extreme feature. And we've got to realize that we can achieve more within our limitations if we stop denying them. Second, we've got to put at the center of our politics a conversation about renewing the international order. It's tempting to say, forget about your conversations, Ukraine needs help now, and we need to act. But that is again an appeal to the willpower of our democratic representatives that has repeatedly failed. Instead, we need to make proposals for a renewed international order and take responsibility for the West's role in breaking the post-1989 world order. Take Iraq. And we need to invite Ukraine and anti-Putin Russians into this conversation. It is magical thinking for Ukrainians and oppositional Russians to talk about joining the civilized world. That is a bit like sending a letter to an address that doesn't exist anymore. Third, we need to acknowledge Western democratic decline and stop blaming it exclusively on irrationality of voters and malign foreign interference. Our citizens are feeling unsafe, disempowered, betrayed, and lost. We can't ask them to back large-scale actions abroad if these actions are executed by institutions in which they have lost trust and which they find opaque. The solution isn't to tell citizens to wise up, it's to try and to be seen trying to do something about this. If we don't, we're going to make Putin's path easier, including his path of challenging Article 5. The higher the trust in institutions in our societies, the easier it will be for us to generate an international strategy and gather civic support for executing it. all of this requires a deeper understanding of the social forces that are undermining our democracies and of why the post-1989 global order collapsed. And for that, watch this video next.